I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the third installment of the SP2 Speaker Series for the academic year. Today we have the honor to have Dr. Ariel Schwartz share her work with us. Ariel Schwartz is a Postdoctoral Fellow based at the Center for Social Impact Strategy at the School of Social Policy and Practice. Ariel works on curriculum development for the Center's educational initiatives, including the Executive Program in Social Impact Strategy, massive open online courses in social innovation and corporate responsibility, and for the Penn Impact Lab. Ariel's research focuses on how grassroots social sector organizations can make good use of donor-funded computing technology. Ariel studies how staff and social initiatives collectively reorient, or don't, to improve their efficiency and effectiveness, especially on arrival of new computing technologies in the workplace. Today she'll be giving a talk on superhero or Puppetmaster, donor-funded technology adoption in social projects. And without further ado,
thanks for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you, and thanks Ezekiel for the nice introduction and for explaining what my dissertation research was about so concisely. I'm thrilled this is my first presentation here at SP2, and so I'm really excited to talk about that research and the nonprofit work that sort of motivated it, some education technology projects in Kenya, and working through my dissertation research to my current interests and some new avenues. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, especially about those. I hope you'll listen to a couple stories on the way, and you're welcome to ask me about any of the spots on the way. My background is in international development and international relations, and my work really brought me to, my dissertation work came from an observation of all this money coming from the foreign aid community spending on technology projects in developing countries. And I had spent my first work out of my master's degree. I was working for a heterodox development economist for about 5 years at Columbia University, and we had a mission to democratize knowledge and really help global policymakers as they went through their global negotiations. We're specifically interested in policymakers from poorer countries who didn't have the resources to bring experts on the topics that they were negotiating in climate change, in intellectual property rights, in trade. And the fact that they didn't travel with teams of experts really disadvantaged them in their global negotiations. And so the mission of this work at Columbia was really to translate academic arguments and academic work to policy relevant, understandable by lay people and negotiable by lay people work that described the trade-offs, the distributional consequences of all of the policy decisions that they were going to be negotiating on, so that they could make their own decisions as to what side of the debate they fell. So this was extremely exciting work, and I really enjoyed it. But I was unsettled by two things, and the first thing was a real high-level focus on one macro indicator. And so, all of these distributional consequences and assessment of the value of those negotiations were translated into a focus on GDP. And so this macro indicator, it's an economic indicator that requires quantification and monetization of pretty much all value that's captured in a country. And I didn't really understand how, and I was curious to learn how those distributional consequences look for quality of life for people in these countries. And so I pursued doctoral research to understand how that global moved to local. And some work that I started in Kenya was really transformational. A trip to Ethiopia actually was really transformational for me and spurred work in Kenya. And so my very last project at Columbia University was in Ethiopia. And I had the opportunity to do a little bit of travel afterwards with my American colleague who I worked with in Ethiopia all the way to Western Kenya. And You'll see this is where we focused. We were in Busia, Kenya, which is really, it's bifurcated by the Kenya-Uganda border. And it's a densely populated rural area. So if you look at the border, you can see, this is the border area, and you can see the road coming from Mombasa, going through Nairobi, and these are oil trucks and agricultural trucks, and the road went through in here. And then if you looked away from the border, you see this like beautiful verdant rural area. That was quite interesting. And when we were there, one of our Kenyan colleagues put forth a very well articulated invitation to help with a community library project at a moment when I could. Starting grad school gives you a lot of free time. And so this catalyzed a lot of nonprofit work as I was simultaneously preparing my doctoral studies, and spurred a bunch of experiments in community library services and information services. And so my American colleague and I were trained in international development, and we were really paralyzed by, we felt very paralyzed by all of the information that we had received about the development disasters, all sorts of ways that people from foreign countries go into other countries and at worst do nothing, or at best do nothing, and at worst really could undermine the activities that were happening there. And so we were trying to understand, we were invited, so it's not like we were trying to do that, but we developed a set of principles that were based on my TAing work in my doctoral studies in social innovation and social entrepreneurship that was based on developing new methods of coming up with ideas for complex, challenging problems. And so this was a really human-centered approach. We insisted that if we were going to participate in any of this work, that it was going to be community-owned and implemented, inclusive of the local and national government. So this was something that was pretty radical in Kenya, at least among the foreign nonprofits that we work with. Demand-driven, we weren't going to look for an invitation, but we would respond to them. And we were committed to continuous improvement, so some sort of understanding of what we were doing and iterating on our work. And then the last thing was context specific. And so this last part was as really part of our due diligence to understand the place where we were working. We explored and spent quite a lot of time researching what libraries look like in Kenya. And so this is a community library in Western Kenya. You could see it says, I don't know if you can see it, says library on the door, and actually there's a lock on the door. But most of the, Kenya is an interesting country for libraries, and actually quite a few countries in Africa have centralized library systems. And so it's a little bit different than here. There's a centrally mandated setup for libraries. And so some libraries, especially near Nairobi, are really organized very similarly to the library system that you might interact with today. And they were established in the 1960s, right after independence. And there were, I think, 55 of them at the time that were active at the time that I was there. And we looked at school libraries, and they took many forms. In community libraries, there would be much more variation in what the libraries look like. And so in schools, in community libraries, these sort of information centers were really typically projects that one or two or a couple members of the community took upon themselves to make some resource available to the community. So they would look very different from each other. One might look like a stack of newspapers in a designated corner that was supposed to be the archive of that city's collection of information. That's what they had for them. Others had, especially school libraries, were often in closets, and they would open the closet in the time when students could access them, and then pull out a couple of cardboard boxes and then put them back into the closet when the library time was over. One thing that I really noticed, and the really key here, was that ICTs were everywhere. So information and communication technologies, I don't know if you can see here, this is a secondary school, and it's filled with computers. This young person is a secondary school student, and he's working at the only working computer in that room. So I saw a huge number of ICTs, old computers, computers in boxes, computers that were broken. One thing that was extremely common among some of the better resource projects that I found was, for example, in Nairobi, in a university, there was a library information services department that had a wonderful, gorgeous computer section. They didn't have great internet access. So you can imagine how challenging learning, getting a major in information services is without having access to the internet. Others had access to electricity problems. And so I just want to note that the technological problems that a lot of these projects had were not very different from other non-computing technological problems that they experienced. So the Kenya National Library Service had a fleet of mobile vehicles, for example. This one is broken down. There's quite a lot of them that are in use, and there's quite a lot that aren't. So I saw technology failures all over the place. It wasn't just related to computing technology. And I also saw a lot of technological misuse, or depending on whose perspective you were taking, or use away from the intended use that the donor offered the technology for. So this is a school library, also in Western Kenya, and this is an example of a non-computing technology. I want to point out this net that's over their garden there. That's actually a quilt of anti-malarial bed nets that this school had repurposed for the purposes of protecting their garden. And if you're familiar with development economic stories, especially in Western Kenya, studies about randomized controlled experiments that focused on figuring out ways to deliver health technologies to developing communities were actually were done here, and they're continued. That's quite an interesting and saturated community of people who are really used to receiving technologies from the world and then figuring out new ways, or their own ways of using them in the ways that they find that are useful, regardless of whatever the intent of those donors were. So taking us really quickly through, meanwhile, our book donations were super expensive, and if they got there at all, these are bicycle taxi drivers who were, so I don't know if you can see their seats are typically on the back of their wheel. They took them off the wheel and put this was actually the most competent aspect of our distribution chain. They didn't actually blink at at the size of our boxes, and they just wheeled the books from our landing spot at the bus station all the way to the libraries, which was, really quite a nice library, especially this one in Busia, Kenya. This is the children's section, and there's a adult section behind this wall. And all this amounted to really competent, what we saw were really competent grassroots organizations doing their best to hustle and receive all sorts of opportunities that the environment had to offer them. And the purpose was really community mobilized and community led attempts to provide services to beneficiary populations that they really cared about and found important. And so once we started getting involved, I started noticing that there was a huge abundance of technology available to us. here's one experiment that my organization did. This is funded by an organization called Smallbean. It's a citizen activist project is the name of the project, and they put a backpack filled with a laptop, a solar panel, a camera, audio recording equipment, and the purpose was to empower community librarians to be the archivist and the historian and the documentarian of their community activities. And they contacted us as sort of like a gatekeeper to identify libraries all over Kenya that could implement this project. And so you could see the sort of like entanglement between what it means to sort of be a community demand-driven project that also, is approached by other organizations that have these resources for the environment, from the environment. And so, thinking about my position in this system, it was a real challenge to decline resources that were readily available, and that you could see that these happy people were actually quite excited to participate in this project. It's certainly not that they were being harmed immediately. I'm not going to talk about a couple of these other experiments that we put together, but I think suffice to say, all of these projects really undergirded my interest. Try to understand why so much money was directed at ICT for grassroots development projects, if competent projects that I saw couldn't really make sustained use of them. Sort of the punchline or one of the key punchlines, I think, in our project in Western Kenya was that eventually these projects this particular library ended up with 25 computers in a space probably a third of the size of this. And they were very excited. It was a thriving library. They were very well used, but we found out that their biggest expense was security, and they were waiting for their turn to be robbed because the municipality's computers had already been stolen by somebody. The person who had stolen them hadn't caught it, and so they were anticipating this project shutting down, or at least the computing aspect of the project shutting down. And so I was really wondering, where this money was coming from. And so my dissertation research was really focused on the funds and these funding flows, and what was sort of in the minds of these philanthropic donors, and where the information disconnect was between those good intentions and the people on the ground. And at the time, you could really see these sort of like gleeful sort of celebrations of what technology can do. So with the power of technology, we can end poverty, save lives, cure disease. This is a Wired magazine cover from 2003. I think it was in May. And so I was looking for criteria for study. I was sure I cared about grassroots organizations that were focused on community work, that demand-driven community work, and it was most important to me that they were competent. I wasn't really interested in organizations that weren't doing well, because we wouldn't expect them to use technology well. But what I was really excited about was competent organizations. I was looking for small ones that didn't really have a lot of technology, and so you can imagine that if implemented properly, a new technology would radically transform the process and the beneficiary experience for these organizations. They might actually, an organization that didn't already have a set of computers or a set of tablets or an app or whatever, might actually be able to meet some of the excitement that the philanthropists at the time were sort of touting. And then I was looking, actually most interesting for me at the time was the fact that the staff were itinerant and mobile. So I found that community library workers were quite interesting, particularly because they didn't have, they weren't participating in a system. So they might have connections with the education system or connections with the local government to rent their space, but they didn't really have supervisors. And so they were really on their own when they were assessing the community needs and delivering these technology services to them. So I thought of 3 types of roles that I saw very commonly in development work that might be good candidates for these. One was the community health worker. One was the mobile librarian. So librarians like the ones that I described, but who took their show on the road. And then mobile agricultural insurance salespeople. So in Kenya and India, and the places where I was most interested in at the time and did most work in at the time, agricultural insurance was a big deal, especially for crop failure, for farmers who were remote, far away from cities, and who didn't have necessarily the funding to, buy insurance. There was all these innovations in the financial system once mobile phones had the ability to take photos and some basic internet connectiveness, like text-based internet connection. They would actually go around, these new insurance salespeople, usually they were men, and would go around to farms and take pictures of the 4 corners of their farm, and the pictures would be tagged with a GPS indicator. And they would have an image of what their farm looked like, and they would just have the farmer send in a periodic photo that indicated that they were really farming. And so when a weather event happened, the farmer could take a photo of their farm and prove that this GPS tag photo was my farm and it was affected by this weather event, and I was entitled to insurance sales. And it completely reduced very heavily all sorts of moral hazard associated and transaction costs associated with offering insurance to poor people. And so this was a really good candidate for study. And the last one was community health work, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more because that's the one I ended up choosing. And the last reason why I thought these were good candidates were because, especially for community health work, education technology, and finance for the poor, there was so much money going to ICTs specifically for targeting to these roles. So the World Bank alone, at the time of my studies, had spent over $7 billion in ICT projects. One international institution, and it really spent quite a lot of money on them. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at my notes and I didn't show you. This, just to give you one sense of what a community health worker that I had already experienced looks like. This is taken in the Turkana. There's a picture taken in the Turkana region in Kenya. Traveled around with a community health worker for a day, and this is quite a remote area, arid area. And the way that he would do his work is that he would drive to a site where he was aware that people lived, and whether that was in the woods or a mountain or something like that, and he would just lean on his horn for about 2 minutes to alert people that he was there. And people would come out with their families, mostly with their children, mostly women who were bringing their children for checkups. They would have a health card, and he would give immunizations, weights, all sorts of maternity care, prenatal care, and that sort of thing. And so you can imagine how challenging it might be for somebody in this position to make use of a new mobile phone that's directed specifically to help these people. So, as you might know, mobile phones were intended for consumer market. They're entertainment devices and do all sorts of work for us. Phone companies don't care how we use them, but community health workers or insurance salesmen or insurance companies want their workers to really use them in a goal-directed way. And so this is a quick little diagram of what that, how that might look from the standpoint of a community health worker. They have this phone loaded with an app, or sometimes there's really just text-based information that they send to a back-end survey. They send forms by SMS and into a clinic that aggregates the information about client data, patient name, all sorts of patient records. And that data ultimately goes to a hospital, a government health agency, a donor in the form of a report. And they can report back to the community health worker in the form of information about that health worker's performance. And so you can see how useful these technologies could be. And if you think about foreign aid as a principal agent problem, from the donor's perspective, you can imagine how this sort of new process would reduce the information asymmetries that a foreign donor might have when they might not question the motivation and competence of this health worker, but they really can't, for years even, assess the quality of their work and the outcomes of their performance. And so something like this would allow the donor to have access to that information much more regularly, much more comprehensively, they hope much more accurately. And you see all sorts of benefits that are often, take place with digitized medical records, standardized procedures, better data quality, real-time monitoring, faster payments if there are them, claim settlements and diagnosis. Most important for the beneficiaries in a moment, in their daily life is really being able to track their patient histories. So if you can imagine a health worker without some sort of digital record, they have a diary, which is just sort of like a register of who they saw on what day and what their patient or client's condition was on that day. And so if you're thinking about a malnourished child or a pregnant woman, it really matters what their condition was 3 weeks ago. And if you have a paper register, it might be very complicated for you to actually locate the information. And so in the moment of the service to the client, it really can help intervene in moments of, when it matters really for life. Okay, so last sort of setup. So I wanted to understand also what the known sources of failure were for these technology projects. There are quite a few. The most prominent technological failure that I heard about was put forth by a guy called Richard Heeks, and he talked about design reality gaps, and this really focuses on the technological aspects of the device or whatever technology that the project is using and the implementing environment. So the design intent for particular technology might be far enough away from the implementing context that the human in the middle can't make a match between the features available on this device and the need on the ground. From the human standpoint, there's a technology acceptance model that really understands the beliefs, attitudes, and opinions of the people who are being asked to adopt the technology. And it's really the perceived use and perceived ease of use and the perceived usefulness of the technology that's most important here. So if the development worker understands what this is for and understands how to use it, they will. Seems pretty clear. And then the last is the component that interceded between the human and the organization, the human and the technology, and this was the social setting in which they were operating. And in this case, it was a technology project. So you can imagine in all sorts of resource-rich settings, so technology adoption is very well studied, for example, in corporate settings and business settings, and groups of employees in wealthy settings and in settings in which they're all in the same room like this, face real challenges to adopting a new technology in a way. So the way that they would have to do that is everybody in the firm would have to reorient all their behavior around this new technology in the same way and towards a certain goal. And so thinking about a university setting, when I was doing my grad work at University of Texas at Austin, the university put forth a challenge for all faculty to move courses from Blackboard to Canvas. I don't know if you had this experience here too. And they put together a 3-year plan to make this happen, to convince faculty that this, at the time, Canvas was vastly better and Blackboard was really quite obviously not very useful for these courses. And so it was a really clear argument from a technological standpoint, but the organization spent quite an enormous amount of effort convincing and cajoling people who were competent to do this reorientation and had the education, prior knowledge to be able to enact it. And it, I think it worked. I don't think they're using Blackboard at all anymore, and it's quite a large university system. But you can imagine that if a wealthy university with a huge amount of financial resources, time to make the change, and training especially, has that much trouble reorienting their staff around a new technology, how a resource-constrained organization in a developing country, especially with a mobile workforce who don't spend all their day in an office, would be. So why exactly do we think this would happen? In the ideal scenario, this is sort of a logic model or a theory of change about what happens in these technology projects when they work. You can imagine there's sort of precursors to acceptance. There's infrastructure and institutional settings that have to happen in order for a project to even consider adopting a new technology like computing technology. You need certainly some money, but also some goals, thinking about an objective, a reason why you would spend your money and your resources to do this work. There's some intermediary steps like having a physical space to adopt this, a device, a software, the time and the labor to put into it, and then some point you take the technology out of the box and see on the outside, you hope, new communication patterns, new data, new decisions. There's new information that comes and new insights that come out of that data. And then you have these new actions and transactions that will ultimately lead to some qualitative and quantitative benefit that achieves a public goal. And I was most interested in this section, the highlighted section, because from what I could see, most of that part was like the critical part. As far as all the information I could find about it was like kind of like a yada, yada, yada around, what happens when the technology comes out of the box and then magically people's health outcomes are going to improve. I found that to be particularly complicated. So I already described, some of the principal agent reasons why ICT use in the workplace might be helpful for understanding what I would see when I went into the field. Also, I talked a little bit about the socio-technical understanding of ICT use at work, and so I really wanted to I was looking for literatures that would help me understand and categorize the sort of the complexities that I would see around goal-oriented use of technology inside an organization. And so I think that part might be the most interesting and for this group. So you might see the all sorts of things that relate to both the technology itself and the organization that would result in reactions relating to the technology itself. That's the hardware and software. And you could hear complaints like, this thing doesn't work, didn't turn on when I wanted it to, it didn't save my work. Things about user interfaces, you might hear that it's very easy to use, I understand what my choices are and how to navigate through the system. Information requirements, like demands from the system to input information like a birth date And then things about organizational fit. So, previewing a little bit of what I actually saw is, you might hear something like, it changed who's in charge. I heard that a lot. It changed who my supervisor was, or what, what information coming out of the field was most important for organizational decision making. We can talk about that more if you care in the question and answer period. So I developed this dissertation, and formally, I just want to read my research question to you because I think it's important. So I was asking, in resource-constrained social sector settings, what project features govern and structure the use of work-issued mobile devices? How do decision makers adjust to maximize the benefit of newly introduced devices while minimizing new burdens to the project and project staff? So I was calling this project Machina ex Deus, and you might be aware of the literary device or the theatrical term Deus ex Machina, and this is sort of like a, I was always captivated by this idea. It's a term that means God from the machine, and this is sort of like the thing that comes in at the last minute and saves the day in the story. And so I was sort of understanding these technologies as like machines from the gods. Like these philanthropic organizations were just sort of gifting these technologies, to whatever was happening on the ground, and I wanted to understand what exactly what that meant for those projects. So my empirical project was in India, and I was specifically studying community health work, which is a World Health Organization designation. It's a role made up to address a global health workforce crisis, and the challenge here is, in every country we have community health workers in the U.S., and certainly in Texas where I did my grad work. And this is community health work is a widely used solution that dates back to the 1950s and 60s in Bangladesh and China. They were called barefoot doctors in Ghana, and these people were typically the criteria for being a community health worker was actually not that you were a doctor. So the whole problem was that most countries have doctors who are too few and too far away from the poorest people in the population. And so, especially if a doctor came from a rural community that needed a doctor, they would have to go to a city to be educated, and they would stay there. And so in India, these community health workers are often referred to as link workers, so people who actually connect people in rural areas or under-resourced areas with the public health system. And the idea was to delegate as much health work as possible to people with the least amount of education needed. And so certain things like diagnosing complex medical illnesses you need a doctor for, but plenty of preventative medicine and information about taking maternal care and taking care of young children is perfectly, your neighbors are able to give you advice on that. In fact, your neighbors do give advice on that all the time, and family members. And so the idea in India was that women who live in a particular community, and they are required to be women. They're required to be, they have children. They're supposed to be literate. And there's a community health worker assigned for every 1,000 people in India. And so this is established by the national government. At the time of my study, there were about 900,000 community health workers in India that had a term called ASHA. This was a accredited social health worker. There were actually quite a lot of other health workers in India, but I was most interested in this particular type of health worker because they actually did their work from their homes and went door to door, knocking on their neighbors' doors, looking for pregnant women and children to give them information in their neighbors' homes, whereas other health workers weren't. And And the last thing is, nonprofit organizations mimicked these roles and employed people who did similar work. They were non-USHAs. So it's really hard to say exactly how many there were, but 1 million is actually not unreasonable. Challenges that they had, they had systematically low pay. They were considered incentivized volunteers, which is a term that I heard used to describe the fact that they were paid when their neighbors did certain healthy behaviors. So if their neighbor took their child to get immunized, the health worker in that community got paid a bonus. Or if one of their neighbors delivered a child in a health facility as opposed to at home, the health worker in that area got paid. And so they were really incentivized to do the information delivery that they were being asked to. And they had real challenges in that their training was low. Because they didn't have, that didn't actually amount to a high enough income to be considered a job. People who could earn a real salary got them elsewhere. And so most women who I interacted with didn't have other job opportunities, and the ones in the cities were really choosing between this or some sort of domestic labor. And they typically chose this partly because of the social access that it granted them, and the home visits were actually quite nice social opportunities, and the dignity of being a knowledge worker was quite exciting for some of them. So, just checking on the time. I did qualitative exploratory research I studied a particular mobile project called ComCare. So it's an application loaded on a mobile phone by a social enterprise that's based in the US but has locations all around the world called Damagi. And their app is based on Open Data Kit, which is a really common data collection application if you ever gone into a field and collect quantitative data. And the way that this works is that you see these are on flip phones. Some of the projects that I studied were on smartphones or tablets, but all the pilots were on flip phones. And these applications are quite interesting. So they have like these little pictures, and they actually speak out loud to the community health worker and the client together, and explains the information about taking your iron tablets or the danger signs of unhealthy pregnancy or things like that, triggers to go to a hospital. And so it sort of teaches the health worker and the client together at the same time. And the purpose was to deliver this information and encourage behavior change among community health workers' neighbors, and also monitor clients better. You could track patient histories with this, and then supervise the community health worker workforce. So I did this study, and I studied 9 projects, visiting 5 of them, and actually following community health workers in 3 of them. The only really, there were plenty of densely populated areas that I studied, but in Bombay and Maharashtra were the really only city projects that I studied. So I said that the unit of analysis is the project. These are really collaborations among a community-based organization or a group of government health workers and some sort of local funder that was delivering the projects that this international organization, that this international social enterprise Damagi was offering. And this was also typically a donor-funded project. It was actually, all of them were donor-funded projects. And so there was sort of like a tangle of funding, technology offer, and some sort of a connector to both of those to the local organization that actually had the health workers in them. They were all new adoptions. They weren't switching from a BlackBerry to a smartphone. They were all targeted towards community health work projects whereby not only did the health workers not have computing technology, but typically the women who were the health workers didn't have access or didn't have their own mobile phones at all. They did have access through their husbands or sons, but didn't have their own. And so, my socio-technical findings were really a description of what I saw when I followed these health workers around and asked them what their behavior was like and watched their behavior. My principal agent findings were really about all this like data and communications and new supervision and enforcement that came out of the use of these technologies. And then my inductive findings, which really weren't driven by theory in the field, but just sort of like wondering what happens when you, health worker, use this phone when you're not using it for things that you were told to use it for. And so I really saw changes in organizational efficiency and the alignment between that health worker behavior and their supervisors' preferences, and changes in oversight and control. And then some of my most interesting findings were about the health worker themselves. And you see, I don't know if you can see, I have a strike through on client health. It was really almost impossible to ascertain whether these phones were actually improving health outcomes, although I found a lot of anecdotal evidence that they were changing the set of information that clients had access to. It's really too soon to tell, and I don't know if I would be able to see that in a systematic way in the project that I set up. So I just want to talk about a little bit about the interesting aspects of my findings for now. So first of all, this is a community health worker in Rajasthan. This is the health worker. This is her client, and I believe this was the mother-in-law of the client. And the mother-in-law in the projects that I studied was typically the person in the household who had control over the decisions that whichever pregnant woman in the house, especially her daughter-in-law, made about her maternal health. So especially about whether she delivers in a health facility or not, or whether she takes her iron tablets or feeds her baby honey or water after the baby is born. The mother-in-law had control, and so you see getting a little ahead of myself, but the mother-in-law had the opportunity to listen to this thing on the phone describe what is a right behavior or a correct behavior. Really had a different authority than a neighbor who was typically a neighbor who came in and did it. So just talking a little bit about project decisions. So the most mundane project and staff level choices, or seemingly mundane, had really important impacts. So one, for example, was SIM ownership decisions. So in India, well, I should say that the question that the projects had was whether to register the SIM cards that were loaded on each of the devices to the project or to the health worker. So this seems like not a very interesting question, but the government of India asks that, or had progressed in response to issues of national security and terrorism, to become increasingly strict on whether SIM cards could be registered to organizations, and and there was a transition time, but ultimately SIM cards really had to be registered to individuals. And so this presented a huge challenge to their community health workers in these projects, because they didn't necessarily have the documentation to demonstrate their proof of identity and proof of residence. And so in quite a lot of projects that didn't manage to figure out a way to have project level SIM ownership, the community health workers were sharing SIMs. So there might be 3 functioning SIM cards among 20 functioning mobile phones. And you could imagine if you need your mobile phone to do your job and there's 20 health workers, but only 3 SIM cards, that really effectively means there's only 3 health workers now in the system that are doing their jobs. And then all sorts of rules around device possession. And if anybody's interested in contracts, come see me later. There's all kinds of stated and walk-backed on rules about what happens when the device is in the possession of the health worker, and then what are the allowed, prescribed, so asked for, required uses of those mobile phones, allowed uses, and then proscribed, what's not allowed. In most of the projects that I studied, those rules were pretty much ignored. And in fact, the supervisors encouraged the use of these devices in ways that went completely against the use contracts that they signed and all of the community health workers signed. And so there was really no project monitoring of whether health workers used their phones to access Facebook or check their children's test scores in school, or use the internet for other sorts of things, especially downloading movies. A lot of these phones became entertainment devices for their families. And then there were all sorts of contingencies for damage and loss. So there are lots of factors that enhanced oversight and control. The remote availability of health workers made, these mobile phones made health workers able to call a medical professional in the case when there was a client emergency. That really mattered for these clients and the health workers. I think what was most interesting, among all the power relationships that I saw in this whole tangled system was between the health worker and the client. So the health worker previously had a really hard time convincing clients. In large part, the health workers described that challenge was because of their low social status in their neighborhoods. So most of the health workers that I had spoken with had moved when they married from their own communities to a new community. And so the fact that they were knocking door to door, going door to door, telling people what to do with their bodies and their family planning decisions was really challenging for them. And what they perceived as their low social status made it very challenging for them to convince their neighbors to change their behavior, especially those mothers-in-law. And so the perception of the voice coming out of the device actually was quite an interesting tool for the health workers of soft intimidation. And so the health workers would say all sorts of things to encourage a perception that the voice in the phone was a doctor. Often it was actually another health worker, a person on the radio, person in Delhi or in the U.S., that the phone was listening, that the phone could actually record the information as soon as the client said it out loud, as opposed to the health worker actually having to enter that information, which was actually the case. And so the health workers found all sorts of ways to manipulate and use these technologies in ways that weren't intended, but were actually in service of the projects. And I'll let you, think on whether the ethical implications and the, whether that was good for the projects or not. Lastly, a little bit more about the new data. There's really high volume, velocity, and complexity of these data. One interesting thing about this social enterprise that was piloting the use of these devices among community health projects is that they were aggregating these data on the back end and looking at community health work all of a sudden in a macro way, and across many countries. And so, given all the interesting challenges that community health workers on the ground that I saw had to importing these data, I think one new avenue of research would be really understanding what these new quantification systems and indicators really mean for our understanding of community health work at the macro level and at the system level. Okay, last thing, unintended impacts were really about the community health workers. These tools were for professional efficacy. All of the health workers saw increased confidence and new literacies on a mobile phone. I talked about some strategic deployment of the devices, other really interesting uses related to use of the camera. A lot of times health workers would take a picture of a interesting or challenging client issue on their body and send that photo to their doctor and get a quick opinion about whether it was a concern. Other use of the camera encouraged health workers' ability to be able to convince their neighbors to have healthy behaviors to complete their pregnancies. So a lot of their clients didn't have mirrors in the house, so they would take pictures of the pregnant woman and to show them what they looked like, so they could see how their body had changed, which was interesting, and also would show clients pictures of healthy babies that had been delivered in hospitals to try and convince them that they wanted a baby that looked like this. But more were really the impacts that health workers found on themselves. So they found their access to ICT really improved their perception of their own social status. So all of us, it's not super clear what how to attribute that new social status, whether that was related to the fact that they had this device that was useful, or that it was an expensive device that was often more expensive than their husband or son's phone. Might be that it showed a sign of institutional support behind their work. So community health workers in places that are, not considered an important role, were able to say it is an important role, and if it weren't, I wouldn't have been given this, complex, expensive, useful, exciting device in order to do my work better. And so there's all sorts of impacts on a blurring of personal and professional changes. And so, I want to wrap up and remind everybody, my motivation was about foreign funding and trying to understand what are the implications on the ground of foreign funding. And I was, I continue to think in metaphors and thinking about, these philanthropists and donors are investing real dollars in improving the monitoring of these health workers, which is in some ways a way to enforce their behavior that in a way that aligns with these donors in the first place. But also, while these technologies improve their ability to enforce that behavior, they also empower in certain other ways that are really important. And I guess I'm ending this this part of my research with a new question, which is really about can you do empowerment to somebody? I spend a lot of time still looking and teaching students of social innovation and social entrepreneurship, and I'm still seeing an excitement about delivering computing solutions in a way that's going to empower is the vocabulary that we hear. And it's I'm just continuing to grapple with the challenge of whether that's even possible, and if we are truly trying to empower somebody, whether we can predict what the nature of that empowerment is. And on the one hand, I think there's huge benefit, and on the other hand, I think for these funding organizations, if they're not able to predict that benefit from the beginning, they're unlikely to fund it. And so there's a little bit of a complex and interesting and useful challenge there for future work. So new paths, and then I'm going to open it up because you've listened to me talk well more than enough. It's been quite a while. I'm interested in pursuing this line of research. I didn't do a gender analysis of this at all. I wasn't really expecting to the fact that my subjects of study were women to be quite as an important part of my findings. So I want to understand a little bit better as to whether these multiple devices are really a feminist technology. I'm interested in pursuing what it looks like when these small pilot projects scale up. Some states in India have already decided that they'll give all of their health workers mobile phones. And so I'm curious about that. I'm also curious about what technology means for organizational learning, for social sector organizations, which have much harder feedback mechanisms built in than, for example, businesses that have a profit-making mechanism that helps them understand whether they're doing a good job or not. And so those sort of like feedback mechanisms about how the organization is doing are really important for technology adoption for these social projects. So I'm curious about those. And last relates to my work here at the Center for Social Impact Strategy at SP2, teaching on social innovation, understanding how the bridges between this applied work and my research work, and understanding how right now the ethics of all sorts of the education technology that I work with every day. So I deliver and distribute all sorts of educational resources over the internet in ways that achieves quite a lot of my educational access goals, but undermines in a lot of ways my ideas for what it means to offer quality education and offer grad students jobs, for example, TA-ships. And so I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about how my research applies to how to make best use of the technologies available to me as an educator here, and also do it responsibly and ethically. Yeah, that's it.